class. What I would like to try here is in the chat, you could help me with roll by just signing in, okay? Just write your name, okay, your full name, because what it'll do is it'll show me the name that you signed in with, whatever it says on your screen, and then your name, just so I know everybody's here. Then I don't have to stop and ignore you and try to take roll. I found that that's really difficult for me to do online. Something about the way that's set up is it just takes me forever to take roll. Plus, every time someone goes in or out, you jump to a different place on the screen, and it feels like I'm on acid. So, yeah, I don't want to do that anymore. It's really disconcerting. Does that make sense what I'm asking you to do? I have to remember too that I am now recording, and so I can't say things like on acid. You know? There, I just said it. Not once, but twice. We're raising a generation of drunks. Okay.
Again, or...
All right. While we're doing that, what I thought I would do is go over a few little sort of housekeeping issues with you while you're taking roll. One of the things I wanted to point out with you, how many of you have the Moodle site available to you right now? Okay, most of you. If not, make a note to check it when we're done. If you look at the Moodle site, you will see these things. You'll see a little link there, and it says, like in Module 1, it says Module 1 Reading Summary. Okay, if you click on that, what you'll see is there's a little description, and it says, start or edit my journal entry. Now, what I decided to do, now hear me out on this, I'm doing this different. I'm trying to get us out of this idea of having to study to the assignment, right? And I'll explain that in a minute. Okay, what these are they're interactive continuous journals that you can do. And so what you can do if you want to is you can start or edit that, and you can take notes as we're going along, right? Then you have those for review, okay? And I'm gonna look at those. Beyond a certain point, I'm gonna say, okay, the deadline's over, don't add any more to the Module 1 journal. Then I can go in there, right? I can go, hold on just a second, I have to admit, Johanna. There we go. I can look at those and just make sure that everybody's up and running and that you seem to be getting the material. You are required to do it. How much energy you put into it is up to you. But the main thing I want to do is make sure you're doing it, okay? That you're doing something that tracks, so I can get an indication, yeah, you're doing the reading. I will be more impressed if, rather than saying, well, Bill said this in class, we say on page so-and-so in the book on Empire, Howe says thus and such. Okay, we discussed that in class and we drew these conclusions or whatever, okay? Does that make sense? Because I know that's an unusual assignment. Did somebody me?
Yeah, I have a question about.
Yeah, well, you would, wouldn't you?
Yeah. So, oh, sorry. When you're talking about the journal, it sounded like you want us to take some notes and put them in there just to see that we're engaging with the material.
Yeah, yeah.
How coherent do these notes have to be?
Well, if they're useful to you, I'll be able to make sense of them.
Okay.
You know, I mean, not just gibberish, but in other words, it doesn't have to be integrated paragraphs and things like that. It doesn't even really have to be complete sentences.
It's kind of like bullet points.
Yeah, bullet points, phrases, things that will jog your memory and remind you, that's right, this is what we studied. This is what we were doing. Because otherwise you're going to forget, okay? So does anybody have any questions about that assignment? All right, has anybody, one second, Cole, has anybody clicked on that and tried to write anything in it? Give it a go. Cole, you said you did. Is that right? You're muted.
Yeah, I did. I've been taking notes for the Dan Kennedy readings, and I've been putting a few of those notes in there.
All right. And are you remembering to save them?
Yeah. So I've saved them. You just have to remember to click save, and then it'll keep them.
Right.
I don't know if there's like a character limit but I've tried it and it has worked.
Yeah, I didn't impose a character limit on it. So if there is, it's something. I've never used this particular format because we've never had to, because we haven't been doing a class like this, a seminar like this where we've been remote. But if you run into a problem with that, email me, okay? All I want to know is that you're continuing to do this, because I may have to go in and modify the link or something like that. Yeah, I think, is that Kyle saying that? It just auto.
Oh, I was just saying it auto-counts characters.
I think you're right. Yeah, that should be all. That was my understanding when I when I created those links. That was all it did, okay? Now, what we're gonna do sometime before we go into module 3 and derived from the notes that you've made, we're gonna have a midterm, okay? But for the midterm, you will be able to use those notes, okay? Not just to study, but you'll actually have access to those as you're doing your midterm, okay? Do you see where this is going? In other words, look, if you stay current with things right now, the midterm's gonna be easy. Only if you don't do that will the midterm be difficult, okay? So are there any questions on that? I understand it's a little bit different way of doing things, but what I'm trying to do is remove that anxiety of pending assignment, oh, my grade, so that you can engage more comfortably with the material. And you'll know before the midterm whether or not you're going to do well, because you'll be able to look at your notes and say, yeah, this stuff makes total sense to me. Okay? Because the midterms, sorry, I stepped on somebody.
Oh. Sorry, I was saying, so this is just in the Moodle, in the reading summary. That's where you want us to be saving these.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
And it's an easier place for you to find them, and then I can drop in and look at them and see how everybody's doing.
Are you gonna be like looking at them like throughout class? Like, I may do mine just in a Word document and then copy and paste it into there.
You can do that too. You can do it any way you want to.
Yeah.
I don't need to look at them until I say, okay, we're done with module 1. And then what I'm going to do is on my little roll sheet thing, I'll have an indication of, I'll probably give you like a, you know, some sort of arbitrary letter grade, meaning, yeah, you really tried hard on this. This is really useful. Well, you did it, but you kind of phoned it in, or you know what, you blew it off. That's about all the nuance there's going to be. It will count relatively little for your grade. It will make a difference on how well you do on the midterm. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, good. All right. And I understand it's different. If it becomes confusing, shoot me an email and we'll straighten it out. Or, you know, you can ask me here in class. So that's the first thing that I wanted to talk about a little bit. Okay. The other thing is, and this is going to be what you're going to be working on throughout class, but you won't really get serious about it until we're into module 3. Everybody for a sort of final assignment is going to do what I'm calling a case study. Okay. And in the case study, you're going to be, let me just check something real quick. I'm sorry, something just froze on me here. Give me 1 second and let me see if I can straighten this out. Come on, man. Yeah, there it is. If you look at the syllabus, it just froze for just a second. There's a description there of what's called the final written assignment. The concluding written assignment will consist of a summary analysis of a specific case of decolonization. The report will be divided into the following sections, blah, blah, blah. You know, identify the case, contradictions and structures of decolonization, the anti-colonial struggle, those kinds of things. All right, I want you to take a look at that. But what I thought I would do is give you an idea of how the questions you might want to try to answer in terms of completing that assignment, okay? The first thing is to identify a current country that you identify as having a significant colonial experience or colonial past, okay? I would prefer very much that you not use the United States, okay? For one thing, you will completely misrepresent it. I can almost guarantee you, okay? But also, I just don't think it's that useful, all right? Identify the colonizer, and to the extent that you can, we're going to talk about this a little bit today, the circumstances of colonization. You know, who was the colonizer and why was this place colonized? What were the circumstances, okay? What, if any, were the opportunity structures that were available in the anti-colonial struggle? In my collective action class, we talk about opportunity structures. And in sociology, opportunity structures are institutional opportunities for people to achieve their ends or gain advantage or something like that. That is, even in conditions of oppression, there can be opportunity structures. Colonialism has those built into it. And by the time you're done, I want you to be able to identify those for your summary, okay? Then situate your anti-colonial struggle in the contemporary regional or global environment. At the time that this anti-colonial movement, you know, was underway, what was going on in the world that might have framed it, mitigated it, helped it, hindered it, whatever, okay? Remember, by the way, if you're worried about taking notes, I'm recording this and I'm going to post it on the Moodle site. So it'll be here if you want to go back and remember these things. Don't worry about that. Okay. Then identify the key leaders and movements of the anti-colonial struggle. Who was pushing this thing? And to some extent, like, what was their agenda? Were they Marxist-Leninists? Were they free marketeers? You know, what were they and who were they? Okay. And then finally, what was the ultimate conclusion and what were the consequences of anti-colonialism as you assess them? What happened as a consequence of this anti-colonial struggle? Presumably, somebody achieved some sort of nominal sovereignty, independence, you know, sovereign status within a commonwealth or something, okay? And explain to me what that is. Now, cite all of your sources. I expect that you will have to do some research and that there's going to be, you know, any number of sources for your case, all right? That's important. Wherever they're available, give me supportive data. Like if you want to argue, for example, well, Ghana was important because of palm oil was a very important resource for industrial Britain and a wonderful source of palm oil to lubricate the gears of industrialization was Ghana, okay? And so the Brits colonized Ghana or whatever. Because, for example, you would not be accurate to say the British colonized Nigeria because they had oil, because we didn't know they did at the time, okay? You see what I'm saying? In other words, what motivated them to do that? What was the advantage they hoped to achieve, okay? All right? Now, and then finally, insofar as you can, try to apply any or all of the kind of conceptual frameworks and things that we're talking about in class. Don't force them if they don't fit, but be aware of them as you're producing your report, okay? Now, in terms of a format for this, and this might be something that some of you are concerned about, this does not have to be linear narrative long form writing. Think of this as a brief report. You know, it's like I'm in the head of some UN commission on decolonization, and you're giving me an updated report on the status of your case. Does that make sense? So again, kind of like with your notes, brief sentences, bullet points, all of them, of course, properly annotated and cited and that kind of stuff. That's fine. You don't have to worry about doing a really extensive long-form narrative. That's not what this class is about, okay? Because part of that is, I just don't think that's the most effective thing to do when what you're trying to give me is this really concise analysis of something. So it allows you to get out from under what you feel your limitations might be as a writer and just report to me. Tell me what I need to know to understand this colonial situation as it came apart. Now, are there questions on that? Does it make sense what I'm asking you to do? Okay, I've got to look at all the screens to make sure. Okay, except for the people who have no cameras. All right. Hey, here's a question. Some of you, when you kill your camera, there's a picture on there, right? A still. How do you do that?
You have to log into Zoom. So the actual Zoom application on your desktop, you actually have to log into that because you have an account set up there. You set up your user profile there, including a picture, and then automatically syncs that information.
I don't know. I was just thank you. I was thinking of putting in something really, really universally offensive and having that be the thing. I just don't know.
I support your efforts.
Well, you know, I mean, you gotta kind of be who you are, and I'm pretty universally offensive, so I figure why not be who I am. All right, so far, any questions on the kind of housekeeping stuff of what we're doing here? I would say as of today, you might want to start thinking about those notes. Okay, now, as a couple of you mentioned, if you're keeping track of those in like a Word document or something like that, and then ultimately you're gonna cut and paste that and drop that in there, that's fine. But just be thinking about that as we go along. Don't try to go back retroactively and do that. You'll exhaust yourself, it will be imperfect, and there'll be too much that you will forget or you won't make sense of. Also, you will then rely overmuch on what I say in class. I will know that, and I will know that you are not trying, and your grade point average will suffer. There, I've said it. I hate grades. Grades are stupid, but that is the currency of the 21st century institution, whether we like it or not. That, along with intolerance, seems to be kind of the standard of American universities now. All right. Is it safe for me to assume that at least a critical mass of you have looked at the first 10 or 15 pages of House Chapter 1? Can I be safe in that? Okay, all right, a couple of you are saying yes. Excellent. Looking like a good, robust thumbs up. Okay, it seems to me that what we're dealing with, and then I want to hear from you, because I don't want to talk quite so much today. I want to hear from you. It seems to me that what Hal's trying to do, first of all, is strip away the values and the biases that we associate with these concepts of empire and imperialism in particular, and just say, look, I'm not interested in advocating or condemning this. The purpose in my book is to explain it. And I think that he does a very good job of that, okay? But that's my personal opinion. He does that, though, by trying to be as precise as he can be in an introductory chapter when he's trying to tell us, here's what I mean by empire. Here's what I mean by imperialism, okay? So first of all, insofar as you've been able to conclude from the first half of that chapter, when he's talking about, empire, what's an empire, according to Hal? It's not just a powerful country.
Is it one that has colonies?
Well, is that what Hal says? I mean, there are people who are going to say, yes, that's true, but what I'm trying to, and I'm not trying to, trip you up, Quinn. I'm just trying to say, let's see if we can be accurate about what he's saying, what he's trying to argue here. Because he's trying to be as objective and neutral as he possibly can, given, like all of us, he has his own biases. So what Quinn is suggesting is that there's an implication, at least, that there's something inextricable in the connection between empire and colonies. Is that right? How many of you thought you got that from that chapter? Okay. He's not, I'll help you a little bit. He's not really clear and he's not really explicit about that because it's an overview of the entire book, okay? So you're at a little bit of a disadvantage there, okay? But if there was a connection, what would it be? In other words, what's something that we might use that would distinguish just a powerful country from an empire?
Doesn't he talk about the morality of empire?
Where does he talk about, how does he talk about, page numbers, but how does he talk about the morality of empire, Paul?
Doesn't he say, I mean, I skimmed over it the other, last week.
Okay.
But doesn't he say that, people see an empire as inherently immoral in some ways, or?
Well, he says some people do, but some people don't. This is how we get into another distinction, though. And these aren't polar opposites. He says, okay, there's empire, and then there's imperialism. And what Paul's talking about, I think, is imperialism.
Yeah.
Okay? And that's good because in order to understand one, we have to understand the other. But as Quinn suggested, we also have to understand this third component, which is the subject matter of the course. We have to understand where colonialism and colonization, because again, you have colonization, which is the creation of colonies. Then you have colonialism, which, as Paul suggested, would be the justification for the creation of those colonies, along with the process of doing it. Okay. One of the things that he points out, if you're looking through the chapter, okay, he brings up something really important here. First of all, the notion of religion. Where does religion fit into empire?
What stood out to me when I read the chapter, and I made sure to take this down in my notes, was the historical notion of an empire. It could first be defined when, well, not first, but the example he uses is when the Kingdom of Britain said they were an empire and they do not owe allegiance to a papacy or any other secular power. They declare themselves, we are beholden only to ourselves. And essentially what that's, the implications of that is that whatever we do, whether we colonize things or commit genocide, we're doing it in the name of our own supremacy.
Okay, that certainly is implied in that first chapter, that there is, and I think this is, Paul, what you were talking about, was that's part of the morality of imperialism, the justification for it, okay? But one of the things that people often don't understand in terms of trying to figure out empire. I'm sorry, I'm looking down for just a second because I want to situate myself in a specific place.
Can I speak on the notion of the role of religion?
Yes, please do.
Yeah, so just honestly, it ties into the whole savior complex of, you know, not only being instructed with religion and being evangelists and saving the souls of the heathens, but also giving it almost like a moral justification of, well, we're here to do good, and all of this is to save them, and we're here, we're you know, it ties into what he was saying, the supremacy. I think it speaks more to a call, you know, a spiritual calling, a spiritual duty, a sense of duty and divine duty and divine support of creating an oppressive structure without
Right.
it seeing
What
being
that's
seen
all.
that way.
Sorry, I have a lag, and so I interrupted you. But what you're talking about is often referred to as a civilizing mission. Okay, you will hear various nationalists and kind of buttressed by religion, but also the declaration of sovereignty that Graham was talking about, saying this is a civilizing mission. That is, this is a moral imperative. We owe this to the world. We are going out with our faith and our technology and our modern ideas, and we're saving the benighted heathen, and we're bringing them into the modern world, and that's a civilizing mission. And we're endowed by our Creator not only with the right, but with an obligation to do that. But one of the things I wanted to refer you to, this surprises a lot of people. On page 14, in the first full paragraph, he begins that with the advent of universalist Christian monotheism, the notion was added that all of these outsiders, that is the people beyond the core, right, were by definition not only uncivilized, but ungodly. This is kind of, I think, what Leo was referring to, that idea that, well, they're heathen, they're barbarians, and we have to save them. Okay, all right? And what he also does is he connects that to the development of Islamic empires. And so what he's saying that is considered by some to be controversial is, you know, what you really sounds like you're saying is there's something intrinsic to Islam and Christianity that is imperial, that compels people toward imperialism. Okay, that's a pretty provocative thing to say. How many of you were struck by that? Because it sounds like that was one that kind of snuck by a lot of you. Yeah?
I mean,
Yeah, I'm sorry, AJ, did you have your hand up?
I was just agreeing with the statement.
Oh, okay, okay. Who did I just-
It's one of the universal faiths, so it's kind of like that's a little.
Right, okay. All right.
yeah, it seems as though it's been used as a catalyst for a justification for imperialism in many cases.
Okay, let me see if I can put that in historical context, because this is one, remember that Hal is trying to do this in a very small book. He's covering a lot of turf. I love these books though, because every one of them is kind of like, you know, it triggers all kinds of thinking in me. If you look at the notion, the one we're most concerned about these days is race and racism, okay? But if you think about racialism as a policy, that's modern. In the history of the species, what we call race, and hence what we mean as racism, these are very modern things, okay? And one of the things that's important about that is most of the distinctions that were made, going back, say, to Imperial Rome, for example, that wasn't about race, okay? In other words, there was not a natural hierarchy of race, which is what a racist would say. That racism implies a natural hierarchy of superiority and inferiority. That's a modern idea. It's hard for us to understand that. Difference was acknowledged, but not as racism. Instead, what was more typical of history at that time, and again, I'm referring you back at least as far back as the Roman Empire, but we could go back, you know, to the predicates of the Bible as well. We could look at that. There were two things. One was ties of blood, family, okay? And the extrapolation of family typically was either clan or tribe, okay? The tribalism was what mattered. And when you look, for example, at the early formation of Judaism, okay, you'll see that is, you know, it's the notion of an aggregation of laws that apply to a specific people. Okay, Jews often used to be referred to as the 12 tribes. You won't hear that expression much anymore. But when I was growing up and learning like what it meant to be Jewish and what a Jew was and what a non-Jew, what a Gentile was, one of the things that that was referred to me was this notion of what we call the 12 tribes of Judea. That is, that early Judaism can be thought of in sort of cultural and political terms as tribalism. That there are these tribes that are chosen by God. And I mean, you can't get much more superior than being the chosen people of God. But building on what a couple of you have already suggested, extrapolating from that, there's a natural justification for what in early stages we might refer to as imperialism. That is, if you look at the Old Testament of the Bible, clearly much of that is an extensive justification of either the conquering or reacquisition of territory by the tribes of Judea. Okay, in other words, we're chosen by God, therefore we have a right to these territories. That holds true in the 21st century with Zionism. See, these things, they're persistent, okay? But remember, that's not racism. It's not the same thing. Because the notion of tribe was, these were people you probably all knew, right? Remember, smaller cohorts, smaller social cohorts, people who were largely nomadic and migratory. You don't assemble large armies and you don't want to go to war because you're barely surviving as it is. So it was, you know, we didn't go to war over the fact that some people might have darker skin or some people might have a different physiognomy. That wasn't grounds for war. It wasn't really grounds for much of anything other than possibly suspicion of the different other. We always have had that, okay? It was more likely in this period of time that what people would try to do is impose a unifying legal system or set of institutions or something. See, the Roman Empire was not fueled accurately by racism. But there was a sense that Rome was involved in a civilizing mission of conquest. And what it was imposing was really two things, at least. One was a unified system of law under which everyone would be protected as a citizen of Rome, okay? That's something that the other tribes, you know, the Germanic tribes and others were not offering, you know. But also they were offering the expansion of technology, the expansion of what we would think of in technological terms as civilization. That is, technology allowing us to transcend the limitations imposed by nature. We're no longer going to be limited by what nature imposes on us. We're applying what we know to transcend those limitations, to expand our lifespan, to find water where no one else can, to refine metals, to build things that help us to resist nature, to develop architecture, to develop the arts, to develop all these things that you cannot do if you're just limited by nature. Okay, does that make sense? Well, that's the historical subtext that Howe is unable to incorporate in any but a sort of passing mention here, is that idea that, you know, empire really is irrelevant until we establish large, you know, permanent metropoles, cities, right? We begin to specialize. Because one of the things that cities do when people settle in a permanent, you know, metropole of some kind, you create dependencies. Because large groups of people settling in a city need food. But a city's not a very good place to grow food. Okay, so that means you need to control the countryside. Okay, so you go out into the people living in the countryside, and maybe you don't want to kill them because you want them to grow food for you. So you say, I'll tell you what, if you agree to help us defend the city, if, you know, from whoever, then what we'll do, okay, and you also agree to give us some of your food, we will agree to protect you. And you can use our city as a sanctuary within its walls if people try to attack us. Okay, that's feudalism. That's essentially feudalism. Okay, so the idea there is feudalism doesn't work very well if the defining feature is racism, because you got to eat and you got to be safe from disease and you got to be safe from invaders and everything else. I mean, there is an us and them. There is war. All those things exist. But just that peculiar physiognomy that we obsess over as race is, at this period of time, and all the way really into the 16th century, is largely irrelevant. It isn't important. Now, does anybody want to either amplify on that, challenge it? That's not my understanding of history or anything like that. I'm trying not to impose these things on you. I'm saying this is the subtext that Howe is trying to create in his narrative. This is not about, empire is not by definition about race. It's about something else. Okay, well, if it's not about race, I'm not saying race is irrelevant to it, but if it didn't start because of race, what drove these sovereign entities to empire? Why did they do it? What were they looking for? Did they just want to kill people?
Well, it would make sense to me that they'd be looking for resources, because even like from the in anthropology, if you like kind of follow just the trajectory of like Homo sapiens as a species, again, as we get closer and closer to modern times, we are in control of our food supply less and less and less with more people. So you kind of start to run out of resources in your own immediate area, and you have to start kind of creating links in different places.
Yeah, I think the only thing I might qualify there was to say that no, we're actually more in control of our food supply, but it's more resource intensive. In other words, we're in control of our food supply right now. I can go to Safeway right now and get all kinds of things even out of season.
Yeah, but until a link in the food supply is
exactly so
until that's cut off.
Every transcendence of nature, you know, like refrigeration and air conditioning and, you know, indoor plumbing and all that, has a limitation beyond which it doesn't function. But what happens is, yeah, you're in more control of those as long as the systems function. But those systems are resource hungry, okay? And because they're resource hungry, what's happening is we've got this, you know, this system, and it allows us to stay in one place, and we've got food coming in from the countryside, and we've got water, and we've got these aqueducts and all this cool stuff, and you know, we're developing this plumbing, and we have vomitoriums and everything else. I mean, we're having great parties and eating things out of lead so that ultimately we're going to be idiots, but that's okay until some of that's interrupted or there's a bad harvest. And then to the extent that you couldn't store food, which is problematic, that's where the food supply, then we are no longer in control of it the way we were. You get used to the idea that food's going to be there until it's not. And so what you're constantly trying to do is mitigate those vulnerabilities, right? And I think, Pamela, I think this is kind of what you were talking about, is the way you do that is you continually push outward for more and more opportunities to acquire land, labor, capital, right? All the things you need to limit your vulnerabilities. Is that kind of where you were going?
Yeah, that's kind of where I was going, because I guess the word I was looking for in that is like resiliency, is that they're just not as resilient once stuff starts breaking down, but you're always kind of trying to make it more resilient in the way that you're exactly expanding outward and trying to bring more resources into the fold. And then I think that's, and as you're trying to justify doing that, you have to find these other ways to justify it. Because if you're taking resources for yourself, you are taking them from some other people. Theoretically. And then if these people are inferior to you in some way, then there's your justification for a lot of the other stuff than you kind of see coming out of like empirical rule.
Right. And what you're also doing, and this is the dilemma of imperialism and why it's more than just commerce or persuasion or offering the bounty of your technology, and why, as Howe points out, all of it is predicated on violence. Because you're going to encounter other people who consider themselves to be sovereign. And they may not think that you're taking resources from them. That may not be what they're thinking in the immediate sense. You're in their land, okay? And because you're in their land, in other words, this is the place where this is their home. They fought over this among each other, and they figured out, okay, I can go here, you go there. Everybody's got plenty of water. Water was the big thing. Everybody's got hunting grounds and things like that. They've resolved that, so they no longer kill each other over those things. Then here come, let's say, we're going to blame everything on Rome today. Here come the Romans. And they're saying, oh, hey, this is great hunting ground. There's water. Guys, we're going to settle here. And we're going to establish, you know, a connection between here and Rome, the metropole. And we're going to start taking, you know, some of this livestock with us and some of this water with us, just some of whatever. Maybe it's, you know, mineral wealth or whatever it is. And then what might initially only have been seen as a violation of sovereignty becomes the plundering of resources as well. I think that's what Pamela's talking about. Is that right?
Yeah, I would say that's accurate.
Okay. And again, I'm not at all interested in being judgmental about this. It's too easy, to beat up on the powerful nation and think, oh, well, that you're powerful because you're a bully. No, you're powerful because you're settled and because you're trying to do what Pamela was suggesting, mitigate those vulnerabilities and be more resilient and reduce the likelihood of crisis, I mean, that's what we're doing here. That's exactly what we're doing right now. We're in the middle of a crisis right now, and we're consuming lots of electricity, not just the electricity in your home, but every server that's involved in sending these signals back and forth to all of us, that's burning up electricity, burning up fossil fuels and everything else. We're just very glibly going about the business of doing that, thinking we're not leaving any carbon footprint at all, because we're trying to persist in this notion of civilization being in part higher education. Okay. So I don't think any of you would think of yourselves as evil for being on this Zoom call right now. And yet, if it means we have to take resources from someone else, and we have to do that, more importantly, at the barrel of a gun, that's where imperialism hits the wall. And that's where it requires the kind of justifications that Paul was talking about earlier. Ryan, did you have your hand up? I'm sorry.
Yeah, but doesn't that end up coming to that point where an empire will put itself too far out there and strain itself, and then the cost of bringing the goods back is more than going to get it, and then put themselves in a corner and then collapse?
This is a concept that's been developed by some later historians that sometimes we're getting way ahead of ourselves, but that's fine. It's sometimes referred to as imperial overstretch. Okay, and the theory is that every empire will ultimately fall prey to this notion of overextension that Ryan's talking about, where the travel line, the transport lines are too long, or they're interrupted by instability or warfare or disease or natural disaster or something. And because you've become dependent on this extensive network of goods and capital and everything else, that's interrupted. You can no longer maintain it. You can't justify the enormous army that's necessary to stabilize that empire and enforce that law that you're trying to impose. You don't have the resources anymore to do it. It's a theory of why empires collapse, because they become overextended, as Ryan suggests. Yeah, now it's a controversial theory to some extent. People would argue that there are other explanations for it, but there is an intrinsic logic to that. Is there no end in sight for the ever-expanding empire? Well, we know that every empire this planet has ever seen has collapsed, with one exception, and that's the United States. We're sort of the last empire standing. Okay. Now, it's an open question, though. Is the United States, properly understood, an empire in the sense that Britain was an empire, in the sense that Rome was an empire, in the sense that, Portugal during the voyages of discoveries was an empire? Spain was an empire. The Netherlands, that was an empire. Okay, are we that? Yeah, Cole. You have your hand up, Cole.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
So I would argue that it's a indirect empire, in the sense that as of right now, the United States does not necessarily have any imperialistic motivation, such as controlling territory or governing overseas. So I would say, if anything, it's an indirect empire, but I don't necessarily see that imperialistic tendency that Howe is describing that an empire would have.
Okay. Brett, do you have your hand up? I can't tell.
I do, yes. It's hard to define an American empire, because we've kind of gone back and forth on the issue, I think. I mean, obviously, Manifest Destiny was it was an imperialist movement across the country, which we weren't really sure where it ended, so we didn't know exactly, it was going to turn into this nice homogenous continent that we ended up with. And that plays back to what Hal was talking about with internal empire, as far as Australia and the Aboriginals there. And then also not talked about as imperialist movement over in the Middle East, but having been there, we very much govern large swaths of Afghanistan, and we did in Iraq too until we left there for a large part. So while it's not formal governance, the amount of military power we had there did leave us in control, and they were all the local, even the local governing authorities were often looking to foolishly, 19 and 20-year-old kids, as you were talking about being lectured by them earlier, they would look to us for guidance and, kind of what do we do in this situation? And it was an interesting thing to have the firsthand experience of being there and seeing that happen, as opposed to the official stance of the government being on a peace mission.
Yeah, well, one of the things that we're going to look at as we get farther into this, because this question of the United States is the United States the first post-colonial empire? Because up to this point, Paul, let me just finish this thought and then I'll get to you. Everyone's kind of quite naturally associated colonialism with empire, not merely the military occupation of a broken government, like invading Iraq or occupying Japan after World War II. That had been the last time we had occupied a sovereign country. Okay, but actually establishing, the assumption being these are permanent colonies, right? The United States hasn't really done that in the way that we normally think of as British colonialism up to the 20th century, French colonialism, Dutch colonialism, German colonialism, Japanese colonialism. Those things, we see them much more visibly. What Brett's talking about, though, is a kind of possibility of a post-colonial imperial regime. That is, it has the other elements we would associate with empire, that it has the projection of force, the projection of economic power, the functional control of territory without colonial occupation. Okay, now it begs the question, can we do that without colonies now, because the next wave of colonialism is technological? In other words, because we have the capacity to engage in what is sometimes referred to as cultural imperialism, with things like first radio and then television and movies and things like that, is that another kind of colonialism? That is, we're colonizing their cultures with our ideas. This is the theory. I'm just throwing it out there. It isn't a cut and dried case for a lot of people when they try to decide whether or not, or the extent to which the United States is an empire. It's just, the term superpower sounds kind of comic book. It doesn't really explain very much. When we say empire, and this is what Hal was trying to suggest, and Paul, I'll get to you in just a second, I haven't forgotten. We're looking at a specific kind of structural architecture and saying, I recognize that that's an empire. Whereas superpower doesn't really have that. It's like when we say that something is a hegemon. Well, what is that? That's a different concept. Paul, what were you gonna say?
Well, I was just going to say that if we're under that definition of a post-colonial empire, if we're defining the U.S. in those terms, wouldn't it be fair to say that right now China is like a rising financial imperialist almost, with their expansion into Africa and the Middle East right now?
Yes, it would. Yes, it would. I didn't want to go that far down the road, but yeah, of course. Yes. Sure, we could say that, there are still empires. They just don't rely on the old school analog version of colonialism. We do it digitally now, we exploit the internet, or we exploit, streaming capacities and Facebook and all these other things. Yeah, Pamela?
So kind of going back to the first part of this discussion, this might just be splitting hairs, but like, how do you explain then, so like the existence of like Puerto Rico and Guam then with us, because those are our controlled territories that we still have. And I mean, even you could make the argument that like Hawaii was a sovereign nation that we like pulled into our statehood to be part of our country to still extract resources from it. So they're kind of participants, but like, how do you explain the fact that we still own Puerto Rico and Guam and like the U.S. Virgin Islands and things like that? Like,
we don't own them.
Okay.
They own themselves.
Okay, but they're still in this like weird situation with us.
Yeah,
where they're not linked to us.
Sure. Well, Hawaii is a state. I mean, we don't own.
Well, I understand
part
that.
of the republic.
Yeah.
But and remember that at least theoretically, those decisions were made by people living in those territories. The same thing with Puerto Rico. One of the things that Democrats might try pretty aggressively to do, depending on what shakes out in the next election, is to push not only statehood for DC, but to try and stimulate a movement for statehood in Puerto Rico.
Puerto Rico, yeah.
Okay. But you're right, and especially Guam is an even better example. And you know, you can look at the Marshalls and a lot of other those are territories of the United States. It's a consequence of the Second World War. Okay, those had been occupied, almost all of them, by someone else, and then as a consequence of the settlement of the Second World War, or by that time, we had taken functional administrative control of them and almost immediately sort of ceded some sort of limited sovereignty to them. Now, a lot of people would say, well, it's not quite the same thing as colonies, and here's why. Puerto Rico, for example, is not dominated by a settler minority. If there's not a bunch of, you know, American-born people who are dominating Puerto Rico. It's sort of Puerto Rico for Puerto Ricans in that sense. It really is, okay? They do have sovereignty in ways that the states don't. I mean, Donald Trump didn't even really know that Puerto Rico, that you were a registered voter. You know, you could vote. He didn't know that. He didn't know that technically Puerto Ricans are Americans for administrative purposes. I mean, that's the president of the United States. But then again, it's Donald Trump too. So, you know, every day's a holiday. But you're right. It's a peculiar, it used to be called dominion status.
Right. Well, and it kind of just seems to me like it wasn't even necessarily like they were like extractive services, more as like they just serve like military strategic purposes because they're islands in particular places.
That's right. And that's exactly right. I mean, Guam is, as I say, even a better example. The only use Guam has to the United States is our capacity to project military force. Because especially when you get out into the middle of ocean, you've got to have places where you can stop, where you can refuel, where you can do reconnaissance, where you can get information, where you can just, you know, give people a break, where you can flee to if you have problems, okay?
Yeah, which makes sense. And it's like, and we have military bases all across the world, but people in those particular places aren't then like, you know, like in Puerto Rico, they're not US citizens in the same way that like Puerto Ricans are because we're using their land for that stuff.
Well, classic example of that is Guantanamo.
I mean, like I said, it's splitting hairs, but like
no, it's not. No, Pamela, it's not. It's perfectly legitimate, and it enhances the notion of, well, then what is the United States? Because the one I think about is Guantanamo Bay. We're not supposed to like Cuba. They're supposed to be the enemy. But Guantanamo, we've been on Guantanamo Bay, you know, for the better part of a century. Okay, and it's not like Cuba's running us out of there. And yet, you know, we blockaded that country. We were doing everything we could to destroy it by isolating it. And yet, you know, it's always, well, Guantanamo, that's theirs. We bought it. You know, because we have a military base there. So there's that idea, though, that we don't want to colonize you. We just want to build an airstrip, you know. In fact, a stranger one for a lot of people was England right after the Second World War, because there were thousands and thousands and thousands of American troops in and around England, and also in Germany, but especially in England, because it was a staging area for the Allies in Europe, okay? One of the most accurate descriptions I ever heard of that was written by a critic in the 60s was, England has become the aircraft carrier of the United States. That is, clearly we're not colonizing them. We don't have to. We just want their airfields. We just want access to their logistics so that we can project force wherever we need to. And historically, that's certainly where Guam would be. Puerto Rico is a little more of a special case, but it is not splitting hairs. It's something we do have to think about. In other words, why was, if we could say, for example, Hawaii was colonialism, then why isn't Puerto Rico? You know, or if we could say, well, no, you know, the Brits and the Dutch and everybody coming over and settling in the United States and displacing people and doing all that's colonialism, but Hawaii wasn't, because those were indigenous populations. Or, you know, people wonder sometimes, well, you know, Jamaica, not realizing that in places like Jamaica, most of the people living in Jamaica are not descendants of the indigenous population, which is pretty much gone. So that's colonialism, you know. But it's not American colonialism, and it's really not even quite. It is British colonialism, but it's not. There's still a kind of dominion status there. There's a very awkward situation. So one of the things we're going to get into, and we may have gone about as far as we can go today, because I think we're running up against the limits of what you've been able to read so far, given I know that you have other classes and things, is this notion of empire, like every other human structure, it adapts to change and evolves over time, or it breaks and it dies, okay? What we saw for most of human history from approximately the 16th century through the 20th century, the middle of the 20th century, was the strengthening, the normalization, and the refinement of the institutions and structures we associate with empire. We also saw the dramatic expansion of colonial territoriality, of the civilizing mission, that we talked about earlier with Leah, things like that. Then all of a sudden, what a lot of people think is, well, then we had the Second World War and all that got wiped out. No, it didn't. Where were the last European colonial possessions dismantled and when? Of the major colonial empires that go all the way back to the 16th century.
In the Middle East, wasn't it?
Nope.
No.
Nope. Mozambique and Angola. 1975. That's the year I graduated from high school. I was a svinga, But if you think about that, it's like, wait a minute, that's fairly modern times. Not only that, that's 30 years after the Second World War. And that's with the United Nations that has this charter that nominally guarantees what? Territorial integrity and self-determination. Those don't sound like elements of colonialism. Do you see, though, why it's important for you when you're thinking about your case study, situate this in the contemporary circumstances of the colonization? In other words, was this pre or post World War II? Did it dissolve after World War II? Does it have anything to do with changing values, assumptions, or institutional power structures? What's the role of the Cold War in all of this, and East-West tensions and bipolarity and all that? All these things become important because in both the Soviet and the American examples, each of those sides claimed the other was the evil empire, was the imperialist. That's when empire became a dirty word after the Second World War. And yet clearly, both the United States and the Soviet Union were involved in imperial missions of some kind. They may or may not have involved colonialism, although I think you'd be interested in where that discussion might go. But it's hard to say that the Soviet Union was not an empire. Just like it's kind of hard to say that the United States, especially when we're the world's only nuclear power, was not an empire or didn't aspire to that. Okay. But it's not the same kind of empire that we're looking at when we look at anything between, let us say, Rome and Great Britain. Those empires. It doesn't look like them. It looks different. Okay. Now, that's about as far as that's a lot to chew on. And if you haven't had a chance to read yet, at least now you know what to look for when you step into the chapter. Okay. Now, one of the things I wanted to ask you, because I know you got a lot of things going on, and particularly for those of you who might be from Northern California, a lot of you I know are concerned about the fires and things like that. It looks like that's where I'm going to be this weekend, is helping some people get out of Sonoma. But I understand there's a lot going on. Do we want to meet on Thursday, or would you like to have that day to just catch up with the reading, finish the chapter, and then maybe come back the following Tuesday and give it one more go before I look at your journal entries and stuff like that? I'm leaving that up to you because what your workload is in your other courses and things like this. And also, despite the fact that we've got quite a few people here, I'm trying to run this like a seminar. That is, I want it to be less like a lecture and more like us kind of talking about these things. And maybe we need
I'm okay with.
Sorry, I'm sorry. I stepped on somebody.
Oh, no, I'm okay with meeting, but it's up to, yeah. My schedule's pretty open. I was planning on having.
Well, you have to be open. The class is scheduled at that time. But I'm just saying, what I would like, though, is that then when we meet on Thursday, maybe we won't meet for that long. Maybe we'll just finish up it might be a 40-minute, 35-minute meeting. That's okay, too. I'd like to be able to finish up with this chapter functionally. And then what we can do is, I'll give you an idea. Depending on how far we get on Thursday, I'll give you an idea of where I want us to be for the following week, okay? Because before too long, I don't want to rush through this, but how's work? It's only a chapter. You can get through it pretty quickly, but I think it's a good starting point for us. It compels us to think about all the moving parts of empire and where colonialism fits into that, okay? But I think we're probably within hailing distance of wanting to go into module 2, which is, okay, let's set aside empire. Let's leave it as the backdrop. What is this specific institutional arrangement that we call colonialism? And we, it might be that, that's where we need to be going. But I'm not in a rush. So why don't let's figure that, let's meet on Thursday, regularly scheduled program. And hopefully by then everyone's had a chance to finish the chapter. At least, as a couple of you said, at least give it a good skim, okay? And make some notes. And again, remember that notes can be questions. If something comes up where you think, man, I don't understand this, what do they mean by this? Put it in your notes, and then you can refer to that as we're talking, and I can try to answer your question, okay? There's nothing wrong with that. Most of these ideas are new to you. That's fine. But I think, though, so far the discussion's taken off at a pretty sophisticated level. I'm pretty happy with this. This is the kind of class where we can kind of go as deeply into this as we want. I'd like to ask you one more question before I cut you loose. And remember, we've only been here an hour, and this is an hour and 50-minute class. So before you start putting the hate on, just remember, I'm getting you out of here quick. One of the courses that I'm scheduled to teach in the spring, because Paul Pavlich has retired, I'm taking over the political philosophy class, okay? I have wanted to teach that class for 25 years. Like I've wanted to teach this class for 25 years. But I was stuck in this sewer of teaching American politics. And I now don't have to do that because Sean Patterson's going to fly in here in his shiny new rig and take over all of that, so I don't have to. He is, by the way, a really brilliant guy. Take some classes from him, because he's I think he's he needs to find his feet a little bit. He needs to unbend a little bit, especially if you're used to some creep like me. He's not creepy enough. I think that's the problem. He needs to be creepier. He may not be organically creepy enough. I just don't know. That was the one limitation I had. I didn't think he was sufficiently creepy. But anyway, I was thinking, because it's really important that I offer that class where there's the most interest. And I need suggestions from you on if you want to take that political philosophy class, what do you want to read about? What do you want to talk about? Because I would like to do something on radicalism. Okay, I would like to do something on sort of the philosophies and theories of political extremism and radicalism. Now that's a pretty broad net, okay? But I'm really interested in hearing from those of you who are thinking, yeah, I would probably take that class in the spring. And I want to try and build, I've got all the way until spring term to build the class. So I'll have all winter term to build it. But if I can start getting an idea from you, just shoot me an email or whatever and let me know what you're interested in. But I really think it's, we're seeing so much of this, and yet we don't have a lot of conceptual frameworks to help us explain the kind of radicalism that appears to be busting out in the United States, because it is starting to look kind of like the 60s in a way to me. It reminds me of what I experienced as a guy just going into adolescence, at the end of the 60s, right? And thinking, shit, we're going to burn this place down. Only this time it looks more like we might do it. And so the idea is, well, let's see, there are these, that's a good one. That's a good nationalism and identity politics. Maybe something like that might be it. But think about it, okay? Help me out with this a little bit, because I really want to build this class for you and teach to something you're really interested in finding more about. I don't want to just teach it because it's something I want to teach. Does that make sense? So I'm just asking you give it some thought. I'm absolutely open to your ideas. More than anything, I want to offer a class that you find valuable. I think that's really important. And it's an opportunity for us to do that, because it's kind of like, hey, it's free fire. We can do whatever we want in that class, okay? And it's going to be a lot of talking and a little bit of reading and a lot more talking and probably just nominal writing, okay? It's everybody's going to get a chance to kind of stretch out a little bit. Internet and media, possibly. I mean, the problem with that is you can have empirical studies, but I really want to get into theory, philosophy, and concepts, and try to explain it rather than describe it. Remember that it's a class about explaining something rather than merely describing it. So like if we had an element of that was Marxism, okay, it's not enough to just say, well, what did Marx say? It's like, why? What was he saying that stuff for? Where was it going? What was its logical end? And how is it different from anarchism? How is it different from nationalism? How is it different from Nazism? Is it socialism because it's National Socialism? No, it's different. Okay? So just something to think about. I'm not putting the whole burden on you, but I really want to try to design an architecture that's attractive to you, where you think, yeah, I would take that class. That's cool. Okay? Anything else before I cut you loose? Okay.
I have a question.
Sorry. Yeah.
I have a question. Maybe so I joined kind of later, but I just got my book in the mail. Is it just this one book, the Dane Kennedy?
No. What we were talking about today, if you go to the Moodle site, there are links to a bunch of other readings, and most of them are a chapter. Like this, the How book is just, I photocopied a chapter. Someday federal prison is going to find me for uniform violation of copyright. Either that or I will flee to China. But yeah, so check out the Moodle page.
Do we need that book? Should we get that book too?
No, all you're responsible for is what I've linked on the Moodle site. The whole chapter's right there. You can read it online. You can print it out if you want. You can do anything you want. Okay? But yeah, definitely, if you haven't, you got to look at that Moodle site, because some of you joined the class kind of late, and I understand that. Definitely look at the Moodle site. Okay? Yeah, Paul.
Yeah, I just had one quick question about, like, what kind of content we're going to be covering. And because we were just discussing American imperialism, and I know it's mostly, I'm assuming mostly with colonization, we're going to be discussing Africa and European colonization, but are we going to tie in any like early 20th century American imperialism in Latin America and stuff like that? Or is that a bit off topic?
Most of the area that I'm going to focus on is going to be Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and probably Central America for the United States.
Yes, like Latin American, early 20th century.
Yeah, because if you get into South America, that's not American colonialism. We didn't. But like in Central America, we
Guatemala, Nicaragua.
Exactly. Yeah. Places where we actually went and we established governments there. Yes. Okay. Yeah, of course.
Well,
and again, when you're thinking when you're thinking about the case study you want to present to me, you want to report on, you might want to take a Central American example, because then you can use that to inform class discussions. See, the idea behind doing these things, and this is why I don't want you to wait till the last week or two of class to do this. If you start on these case studies right now, you can begin to enhance our discussions by including those examples in our discussions to illustrate various concepts. Paul's talking about, the American, what's often called American adventures in Central America. That's the way they used to be described. Well, that's another way of describing colonialism and imperialism. Yeah. Some people might want to look at the Philippines. That's a particularly troubling example. Okay, where clearly there's a kind of colonialism, absolutely there's imperialism, but it doesn't really necessarily fit the mold, partly because it involves the United States, and we just did things differently. Not better, but differently. But so I hope that answers your question. Okay, anything else? All right, then I'll see you on Thursday. I think in terms of role, we'll just keep doing it the way we've been doing it, where I'll have you use the chat to sign in. And then, no, case study, the Mormon Church is not colonialism. Yeah, you could analyze that in a lot of different ways, but that's not colonialism. It's an interesting study, but it doesn't really fit into the architecture of colonies and imperialism. Okay, anything else? All right, then I'll see you on Thursday.